You're about to get a framework that makes this vague term structure so much easier to understand. With this framework, the idea of analyzing the structural devices in a text or using structural devices to create a text will be easier than going on Instagram during your morning commute to school. Sound too good to be true? There's only one way to find out.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Past WACE exam questions. Here are all the times the term structure has popped up in a past WACE exam question between 2016 and 2022. Probably sounding like a bit of a broken record at this stage. I said this in the lesson on language features and in the lesson on language patterns, but just because the term structure has only popped up in 4 past WACE exam questions, it doesn't mean that your understanding of structure can't be applied in questions that don't explicitly mention the term structure. Your understanding of structure, this concept of structure, structural devices, can be applied in practically every WACE exam question that you answer, really every exam question or every English question that you answer. Here are the relevant syllabus points. As we can see, we've got 2 points where structure is mentioned, or a version of the word structure. Analyzing language, structural, and stylistic choices comes up in Unit 3, syllabus point 1, and then using and experimenting with text structures and language features related to specific genres for particular effects, and that comes up in Unit 3, syllabus point 13. Lesson objectives. What are we going to get up to? Illustrate how syllabus points manifest in exam questions. Then we will define structure, outline the categories of structure, explain the first category of structure, explain the second category of structure, and then demonstrate an analogy to understand the subcategories of structure. This analogy is that framework that I alluded to at the beginning of the lesson. Then we will discuss structural devices. After that, we'll analyze some past WACE exam questions, and then we will outline a simple summary. Before we take a look at what this term structure actually means, what it refers to, I'd like to quickly revisit those syllabus points and past WACE exam questions to illustrate how they connect, how the syllabus points manifest in the past WACE exam questions and the exam questions that you're going to get in this year's exam. Here are those 2 syllabus points that structure appears in, and this is the category of exam question that each syllabus point relates to. Firstly, analytical questions, they relate to this syllabus point over here in Unit 3, and the giveaway for how they relate to one another really comes from this word analyzing. In syllabus point 1 from Unit 3, we've got analyzing language, structural, and stylistic choices, and here we have got analytical questions, and they come from the comprehending section and the responding section. Then the final syllabus point, this one here, using and experimenting with text structures, that one relates to creative questions or questions that come up in the composing section of the exam. Here are examples of past exam questions that relate to each syllabus point. In other words, here are examples of how each syllabus point has manifested in past WACE exam questions. For the first syllabus point, the one that relates to analytical questions, we've got explore how the patterns of language or structure are used to represent a complex idea in at least one text. And then we've also got how have language or structural innovations been used to unsettle an audience in at least one text. These questions require you to analyze structural devices. How about examples of creative questions? Firstly, lost in the solitude of his immense power, he began to lose direction. Compose an interpretive text that uses this quote at a key point in its structure. Another one, create a text in a form of your choice that experiments with structural features to enhance its central idea. To tie this up in a nice little bow, what is the rationale for me putting these questions over on the analytical side and the other 2 questions over on the creative side? Basically, the analytical questions, they require you to analyze the structure of text. And then for the creative questions, they require you to use structure to create text. We'll go through this sort of exercise a few more times in this module, just for you to be able to see that link between the syllabus points and then how they actually manifest in exam questions. So you can start putting yourself in the shoes of a WACE marker, and even better, SCARSA, the people who actually create the WACE exam questions. That's to say that this exercise, it doesn't just apply to the concept of structure. You can try and identify the connections between syllabus points and exam questions for any concept that we're learning in this module. Definition of structure. Let's check out the glossary definition. Text structure, the ways in which information is organized in different types of texts, for example, chapter headings, subheadings, table of contents, indexes and glossaries, overviews, introductory and concluding paragraphs, sequencing, topic sentences, taxonomies, cause and effect. Choices in text structures and language features together define a text type and shape its meaning. Examples of text structures in literary texts include sonnets, monologues, and hypertext. Okay. And we're not done. One other thing that I wanted to point out was the appearance of this sentence here. Choices in text structures and language features together define a text type and shape its meaning, and how that manifests or appears in the definition on language features that we looked at 2 lessons ago. What does this mean? It means that language features and structure go hand in hand. This will start to make more sense as we look at some examples throughout this lesson. Before we get to those examples, we've looked at the SCARSA or the glossary definition of structure. How about the English ATAR made simple definition of structure? We're going to keep it nice and simple. Structure simply refers to how information is organized in a text. I don't know about you, but I prefer the simplicity of that definition over the wordiness of the SCARSA one. That's our definition. Bear that in mind as we start looking at this next part of the lesson, which is categories of structure. I'll give you an overview of each category of structure and the subcategories, and then we'll go into more detail for each one. Category 1 is the structure of written text. Category 2 is the structure of visual and multimodal text. Example of a written text, a novel. Example of a visual text, we've got a photograph. Example of a multimodal text, we've got a film. Subcategory A, this one is sentence structure. Sentence structure applies to both category 1 and category 2, but with the little caveat that for sentence structure in category 2, it doesn't apply to texts that have no words in them. A classic example of that would be a photograph of a tree. There are no words in the photograph of a tree, therefore this concept or this subcategory of sentence structure doesn't apply. Subcategory B, we've got passage structure and scene structure. Once again, we've got a bit of a caveat for subcategory B over in category 2, and that is it doesn't apply to text with no scenes in them. For example, still images like that photograph of a tree, it's just one still image, so we can't analyze a scene in it. Lastly, subcategory C, we've got whole text structure and whole text structure. That's our overview of the categories and then the subcategories. Now let's have a look at each one in more detail, starting with category 1, structure of written texts. To specify even further, let's focus on subcategory A, which is sentence structure, aka syntax. You might be wondering why I'm discussing syntax in this lesson when it's already been discussed in the workbook activities on language features. Specifically, syntax is quite a big part of the language features Bible. Why is it in language features and also in structure? The answer to that is syntax is considered to be an element of structure and a language feature. By this stage, you should have a revision schedule for revising the language features from the language features Bible. And if you are following that schedule, you will be learning about syntax as you go. So I'm not going to discuss syntax in here because it's just unnecessary repetition. With that being said, for the purposes of this lesson on structure, just make sure you know that syntax, sentence structure, is one way in which you can discuss the structure of a text. Subcategory B, passage structure. Passage structure is how information in a short extract or a paragraph is organized. And a classic example of this is the teal body paragraph. No doubt you have heard about this ad nauseum. We love it. We'll be coming back to teal later, so don't worry. Subcategory C is whole text structure, and this refers to how all the information in a text is organized. Example, an essay that you're going to write in the responding section of the exam will likely follow the whole text structure of having an introductory paragraph, then 3 body paragraphs, and then 1 concluding paragraph. These paragraphs here, they represent the whole text structure of the essay that you've written. So that's a discussion on category 1 and the 3 different subcategories within category 1. Now let's discuss category 2, which is the structure of visual multimodal texts. As we saw in our overview a few minutes ago, subcategory A for this category is also sentence structure or syntax. Everything that I said earlier applies here. I'm not going to repeat myself. Subcategory B, however, is a bit different from subcategory B in category 1. Instead of passage structure, we've got scene structure. And this refers to how the visual elements in a scene are organized. Nice and fresh example of how the visual elements in a scene are organized. We've got the Gom Jabbar scene from the previous lesson on language patterns. The way the shots of Paul and Jessica alternate throughout the entire scene is an example of a structural element being used. Lastly, subcategory C for category 2 is whole text structure. Once again, this has the same meaning as subcategory C for category 1, and this is just how all the information in the text is organized. Example, we've got the 3-act structure of a feature film, and this consists of Act 1, the setup, Act 2, the adventure, and Act 3, the resolution. Before we move on to structural devices, I want to go over an analogy that I think will be pretty helpful in helping you understand the differences between those subcategories of structure that we've just discussed. Our 3 subcategories of structure are sentence structure, passage or scene structure, and then whole text structure. And I'd like you to think about those subcategories as though they're different levels of zoom on your camera's phone. So when you're analyzing the whole text structure, it's like you're using the 0.5 zoom on your phone's camera app. You're looking at the entire text structure from a bird's eye view. Then when you're analyzing the passage or the scene structure, it's like you're using the 1x zoom on your phone's camera. You're looking at the structure of a passage or a scene from the text pretty closely. Finally, when you're analyzing the sentence structure, it's like you're using the 2x zoom on your phone's camera. You've zoomed all the way in to focus only on the structure of a sentence in the text. And that is the framework for understanding the categories of structure and then the subcategories that fall within them. Just imagine they're like the different zoom settings on your phone. Now let's move on to the next part of the lesson, which is all about structural devices. Just an FYI, these structural devices are mainly applicable to passage or scene structure and whole text structure, and they don't apply to sentence structure or syntax. First device, foreshadowing. Definition, a hint of what is to come later in the text. Effect, it enhances plot cohesiveness. If there is no indication, no hint at some sort of big revelation that's going to come later in a text, throughout the text, leading up to that revelation, the audience is going to feel blindsided, and there's a greater chance that revelation won't really make that much sense, and it'll feel cheap. It'll feel like the text creators have just chucked it in there to include a plot twist. When there is foreshadowing, it makes the different elements, those different hints along the text, make sense. It's like, oh, that's what all that stuff was about earlier on. It enhances the plot cohesiveness. It makes it one whole text rather than all of these elements throughout the text and then just this random plot twist at the end. An example of this one is from Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. The foreshadowing is that Anakin Skywalker is told that he is the chosen one and that he will bring balance to the Force. The foreshadowing specifically is that, yeah, he did bring balance to the Force in one aspect, but he just brought balance to the dark side of the Force to make it even with the light and not the other way around. Next device, shifts in time. This is just a shift backwards or forwards in time from the time of the main story. The effect, it provides some contextual information. Also, it facilitates or helps telling multiple stories at once. Also, contributes to a text creator's style and voice. Some directors are known for shifting in time, going back in time a lot, going forwards in time a lot. That becomes a part of their style. Example, can't go past Back to the Future. The main story takes place in 1985, then the main characters travel back in time to 1955. Shifts in place. Definition, a shift in location from the location of the main story. Nowadays, with the big production value of most films that come out, shifts in place are guaranteed to happen in basically every movie. But now that you've got a name to describe it, doesn't hurt to apply that understanding. Effects, makes the plot interesting. A text has to have a lot of other things going for it if it's going to be interesting, despite it being told all in the same place. And another effect, it adds a sense of adventure in certain circumstances. Example, we've got The Matrix. In The Matrix, we're shifting from the real world to the dream world. Shifts in point of view. Definition, a shift in the way the story is told. Effect, it helps the audience see different perspectives on something within the story. Example, Gone Girl. This is a pretty big example. The perspective shifts between Nick, who's Ben Affleck, and Amy, who's Rosamund Pike. Motive. A motive is a recurring element, concept, image, phrase, or situation that is integral to the plot of a text. Effects, it emphasizes the overall theme of a text, and it also helps readers comprehend the underlying message of a text. An example is the Harry Potter series. The motif of Harry's scar is emphasizing the themes of destiny and the power of love. Some other examples, we've got The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The motif of childhood emphasizes the themes of innocence and open-mindedness. And then another example, To Kill a Mockingbird. The motif of Maycomb or Maycomb, I don't know which one it is, that's the setting, and that is emphasizing the themes of goodness and pleasantness in life. A note about a motif, it is also a language feature. Next, structural device, we've got withholding. This is not providing the audience with information that's relevant to the plot until later. Effect, it creates a sense of suspense and mystery. A good example of this one is the movie Psycho. In this movie, the identity of the serial killer is withheld. Next up, surprise revelation, aka plot twist. This is something that happens in a text that's out of the blue or unexpected. Effects, it shocks and surprises the audience, and it enhances the memorability of the plot. Some of the greatest plot twists in movies, for instance, you just don't forget. And a fantastic example of this, one of the best movies ever, Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2. Good old Taylor Lautner. And another example of a surprise revelation is Fight Club. If you've seen either of these movies, you'll know exactly what I mean. If you haven't, I'm not going to spoil the surprise revelations for you here because they are worth watching and experiencing them live. But if you were to choose one, definitely watch Twilight. No, please don't. Definitely watch Fight Club. That is the one that you should go for. In media res. This one is a Latin term which translates to in the midst of things or simply just beginning in the middle of the action. Our effects creates a frantic mood and it impacts the pacing of the plot. Example, we've got Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. This one begins with an action sequence with Spanish Doctor Strange and America Chavez. Once again, if you've seen this movie, you'll probably remember the scene I'm referring to. It's right at the beginning. It begins in the middle of the action, literally. But we'll also be looking at a more extended example of in media res at the end of the lesson. Next, structural device, alternating structural device. And this is when a text shifts from one thing to another repeatedly to create a certain effect. And the effect is generally that it establishes a connection between two different events that are occurring simultaneously. Our example for this, again, it's that June Gom Jabbar scene. The scene alternates between shots of Paul enduring the pain of his hand in the box and shots of Jessica standing outside the room in anguish, as though she's experiencing the pain that Paul is. This shouldn't come as a surprise, but this is also a language pattern. Next structural device is juxtaposition. This is the placement of two contrasting things beside one another for contrasting effect. Our general effect is it exaggerates the difference between the things that are placed close to one another. Note, juxtaposition is also a language feature, and it can take place in words, photography, cinematography, and editing. There are examples of each type of juxtaposition in the Language Features Bible, so go and check that out for further reading. But the example that we'll look at here is juxtaposition in editing because that is the clearest example of juxtaposition in the context of structure. To illustrate the effects of juxtaposition in editing, here are two batches of 3 different photos. The photo here that we've got on the slide is a photo of Alfred Hitchcock. He is the director of Psycho, mentioned a bit earlier, and he's known as one of the greatest directors of all time. Alfred Hitchcock sees a mother and her child, and he's happy. That's the first example. The second one is Alfred Hitchcock sees a woman sunbathing, and all of a sudden he looks creepy. In this second example, the decision to place the image of the sunbathing woman before this image, that decision is a structural one. The two images placed close to each other create a contrasting effect. Next structural device, we have circularity. This is when the story begins by showing what happens at the end of the story, then the rest of the story is about what happens to lead up to that ending. An effect of this is that it immediately captivates the audience by encouraging them to ponder how the protagonist or protagonists arrive at the end of the story that we see at the beginning of the movie or the text. Pulp Fiction. This is a great example of a movie starting at the end and then ending at the same point. Definitely give this one a watch if you haven't already. Next example is sequencing. Sequencing refers to manipulating the specific order in which information is presented. The effects determines how and when the audience interacts with information in a text. It influences the clarity of the text and it conveys nuanced meanings. Example of this is The Dark Knight. The specific example of sequencing that I'm referring to is the bank heist scene at the very start of the movie. I've included a link to the scene in the PDF study notes and a brief analysis of that scene as it relates to the use of this structural device of sequencing. I'm not going to go through it in this video because we've got a more detailed example of sequencing at the end of this lesson, but that one is a nice example to just get the main points. Next structural device is chronological or linear. Definition, it's the presentation of events according to the order in which they occurred. Effect, it enhances the realism of the plot. And our example is 1917. Not sure if you've seen this one, but the movie is about 2 hours long and it's designed to look like the whole story has been shot in one take. As a result of this, the story is presented in chronological order. Framed, aka embedded. This is a story within a story. Just imagine that a large picture frame represents the main story, and then there is a smaller picture frame within the larger one, and that represents the framed story. The effect, the embedded story normally develops the main story's plot. Example, can't go past inception, a dream within a dream, within a dream. Those are all the structural features. Let's see how we can apply that understanding of structural devices in the context of a WACE exam. First example is going to focus on the specific subcategory of scene structure in a visual text. The question that we're going to look at is how have language or structural innovations been used to unsettle an audience in at least one text? This one comes from the 2018 WACE exam, specifically the responding section and question 9. The text that we're going to analyze is Spider-Man No Way Home. There's a link to this opening scene in the resources tab below this video. So pause this lesson now, go and watch it, and come back once you're done. Watching Marvel movies while studying for English ATAR? What? Hello, welcome back. You've just seen the opening scene. Hopefully you were able to figure out which structural device was used, and that is in media res, which you'll recall from a few minutes ago. It just means beginning in the middle of the action. How is this device used in the text? No Way Home begins exactly where the last Spider-Man movie ended, which is where Spider-Man's identity was exposed to the whole world. What are the effects of this device? John Watts, the director of this movie, sets an intense and frantic mood from the outset. This had the effect of immediately gripping the audience because they're immediately invested in how Spider-Man is going to live his life now that his whole identity is exposed to the world. It also has the effect of unsettling the audience. Unsettling means causing anxiety or uneasiness, and this is something the audience likely felt after seeing Spider-Man's life in such a mess. Finally, what is the relevance of this example to the exam question that we saw earlier? In that question, the question requires us to discuss language or structural innovations. Structural innovations, plural, so we need to talk about more than one innovation. And this word innovation is just a confusing word for a device or a feature. One such structural innovation or structural device could be in media res. Bearing that in mind, we devote one body paragraph to analyzing how John Watts' use of in media res as a structural innovation works to unsettle the audience in Spider-Man No Way Home. Then, in our remaining 2 body paragraphs, we discuss 2 different structural devices or structural innovations and how they are respectively used to unsettle the audience. Example number 2, a written text, and we'll take a look at whole text structure. Our past WACE exam question is explore how the patterns of language or structure are used to represent a complex idea in at least one text. This one comes from the 2016 exam, specifically section 2, question 6. This is the example we're going to analyze. It's a mini thesis that I wrote just before I finished uni, and it's about copyright law and non-fungible tokens. How exciting. So the structural device that we're going to discuss in relation to this mini thesis I wrote is sequencing. How was that device used in the text? It would probably help if you could get a glimpse of the text before we go any further. So let's check it out. All right. And here we are. This is the mini thesis I wrote at the end of 2021. This was a very satisfying moment for me when I submitted this assessment. It represented the last assignment that I had to submit for law school. So how does this relate to sequencing? Why are we even looking at this example? The main thing that I want to highlight for you in this example is how headings are used and how they're ordered to make understanding the information that I'm presenting in this paper easy to understand for someone who knows nothing about non-fungible tokens. I'll run through the structure of the paper as an overview, and then we'll pinpoint a specific section of it. Firstly, introduction. Next section is understanding NFTs. Then a subsection is nomenclature, which is just a fancy way of saying terminology. Then a subsection of that, talk about blockchains. Subsection, talk about Ethereum. So you can see how there is this kind of organization of subheadings. Then the next subheading under this section of understanding NFTs is the connection with copyright. And then the next section of the paper is called just major questions. A subsection is this thing called subsistence and ownership. Don't worry about that. That's copyright stuff. Another section is infringement. Again, copyright stuff. And finally, conclusion. So overall, there are 4 sections in this paper. The first one is introduction. The second one is understanding NFTs. The third one is the major questions. And the fourth one, as we can see here, is conclusion. The point about sequencing, the use of sequencing as a structural device in this paper is this. It's a really basic one, but it drives home the importance of how information is ordered, the importance of the use of sequencing as a structural device very clearly. I have put understanding NFTs as subsection 2. Then I put the major questions as subsection 3. Subsection 2 explains what NFTs are. And I wrote this so that anyone who has, a year 10 level of reading and general intelligence and above could read section 2 called Understanding NFTs. They could read it and have a pretty good idea about what NFTs are. I made a deliberate decision to put this section 2, before section 3, which is called the major questions, because I couldn't discuss the major questions about NFTs and copyright if someone doesn't have that preliminary understanding of NFTs. When I wrote this almost 2 years ago, NFTs had just become a thing and people really didn't know what they were. So I knew that my copyright law professor, who already knew what copyright was, they wouldn't know what NFTs were. So I had to clearly explain what NFTs are in section 2. So then the copyright professor could go into section 3, having that preliminary understanding. So then they're in a position for me to discuss how NFTs and copyright relate. All of that stuff that I just discussed was very deliberate. They were deliberate decisions that I made to sequence the information in a specific order so that the reader could understand it easier. Sequencing is so important. Just imagine if I went and discussed the major questions about copyright and NFTs before I explain NFTs. In other words, I described and explained the major questions, and then afterwards, I explained what NFTs are. The text, this whole paper just wouldn't make that much sense. That is really what sequencing is getting at. We are back to the presentation. Let's go over the main point that I discussed in that overview of my mini thesis. We're talking about sequencing and how it's used as a structural device in whole text structure and it's written text. As I mentioned in that overview of the text, there's nothing fancy about my use of sequencing. It really just explains what NFTs are before discussing the major questions regarding copyright and NFTs. What is the effect of sequencing the text information in this way? It ensures that readers develop the requisite knowledge to then understand the rest of the paper. It ensures that someone who reads the text knows what NFTs are before they get into the discussion about copyright and NFTs. Then let's tie it back to the past WACE exam question. How does this discussion that we've had about the paper, about sequencing, apply to that question? The question asks us to explore how patterns of structure are used to represent a complex idea. The so-called complex idea in my paper is that NFTs are misunderstood. So the idea itself that NFTs are misunderstood, that sounds simple, but then explaining that idea is complex, and that's what gives it that element of complexity. The other thing to note is that the question stipulates patterns of structure, meaning we need to talk about more than one. So in this case, we'd likely discuss one pattern of structure per body paragraph. One of my body paragraphs in response to this question could focus on how the structural pattern of sequencing is used to represent the complex idea that NFTs are misunderstood. Specifically, this body paragraph could explain how my paper is sequenced in such a way to outline all the relevant concepts surrounding NFTs before getting into the substantive discussion about NFTs and copyright. A specific example of sequencing in my paper could relate to the sequencing of different headings. So as we saw, there were large headings, medium headings, small headings, small headings, and so on and so forth, and how they're used to illustrate how all the different concepts relate to one another. For example, understanding NFTs, that was the title of section 2. Beneath that, there was the subtitle, nomenclature. Beneath that was the title, blockchains. Beneath that, Ethereum, and then beneath that, Ethereum's cryptocurrency. So there were different levels of headings that conveyed how the different bits of information related to one another. Okay, is everything I wanted to say about structure? Let's go through a simple summary of the discussion we've had about it. First up, we discussed how the syllabus points manifest in exam questions, and we learned that if a syllabus point has the word analyzing in it, it will likely be relevant to section 1 or section 2 of the exam. If a syllabus point has the word using in it, it will likely be relevant to section 3 of the exam. Then we discussed the definition of structure, and we learnt that it just means how information is organized in a text. After that, we looked at categories of structure, and we learnt that category 1 is the structure of written text, and subcategory A within that is sentence structure, aka syntax, and that just means the arrangement of words in a sentence. Subcategory B is passage structure, and this refers to how information in a short extract or paragraph is organized. Our example is teal, a teal body paragraph. And subcategory C is whole text structure, and this refers to how all the information in a text is organized. And our example of this for a written text is introduction, body paragraphs, and conclusion. Category 2 was the structure of visual and multimodal text. Subcategory A is sentence structure, aka syntax, which, as you recall, it has the same meaning as it does in the context of structure for a written text. Subcategory B is scene structure. This refers to how the visual elements in a scene are organized. An example for this one was the use of an alternating structural device in June. Subcategory C is whole text structure. Again, this has the same definition as whole text structure in written text, which is that it refers to how all the information in a text is organized. Our example for whole text structure in a visual multimodal text is the so-called 3-act structure of a feature film, which refers to the setup, the adventure, and the resolution. We then discussed how to understand the subcategories of structure, and we used a bit of an analogy. And we learned that we can understand this subcategory of whole text structure as though it's 0.5 times zoom on the phone's camera. We learned that we can understand passage and scene structure as though it's 1 time zoom on the phone's camera. And we learned that we can understand sentence structure as though it's 2 times zoom on our phone's camera. Then we looked at structural devices, and here is an overview of all the structural devices that we looked at with the examples. Apologies for the crowded slide. I reached the slide limit on Canva for this lesson. Bear with me. As we saw, foreshadowing, our example was Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, how Anakin is foreshadowed as the big baddie. We also saw for shifts in time that our example was Back to the Future, go from 1985 to 1955. We saw for shifts in place, we've got The Matrix, we've got the dream world, and then the real world. For shifts in point of view, we had Gone Girl, we had Nick's perspective, and then Amy's perspective. For motif, we had the example of To Kill a Mockingbird and the motif of Maycomb, which is emphasizing the theme of the goodness and pleasantness of life. Then withholding, we had the example Psycho and how the identity of the serial killer is withheld until the very end. Surprise revelation, Fight Club's plot twist, not going to spoil it for you, one of the greatest plot twists in movie history, in my opinion. Then in media res, beginning in the middle of the action, our example was Spider-Man No Way Home. Alternating, we had Dune, gone through that example so many times, not going to go through it again. Juxtaposition, we had the example of that photo of Alfred Hitchcock going from him looking at a woman and her child to him looking at a woman sunbathing, and how they're using the same two images, but the one in the middle creates a completely different effect when you look at the last image. Then we looked at sequencing, and the example for that one was the bank heist scene, the opening scene of The Dark Knight. After that, we looked at chronological. The example was 1917, and how the movie is shot to look like it's all shot in one take, and how it takes us from the beginning of the story all the way through to the end in chronological order. Lastly, we had framed, and the example for that one was Inception, a story within a story, or a dream within a dream within a dream. The final main section of this lesson was looking at past WACE exam questions. We looked at 2 of them, and the main takeaway from that part of the lesson was that a Section 1 or Section 2 exam question about structure requires you to analyze how structural devices are used in a text. That is it for this lesson on structure. Make sure you go and check out the workbook activities for this lesson. They require you to identify and analyze structural devices in relation to 2 studied texts, and similar to the activities for the lesson on language patterns, you'll be doing that in text tables. Good luck with that. Looking forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Until then, keep it simple.